after the summer. I think this gets a very special meaning in these days. After the summer, it's not just a calendrical message, but it is a message that we all can feel in our bodies these days. And all the more, I would say, a very warm welcome to you for this lecture at IWM. I am Ludgar Hagedorn, Permanent Fellow, working here at the Institute. Welcome to all of you on behalf of the IWM, on behalf of my colleagues, and in the name of our rector, Misha Glenny. We are very happy today to have Nergis Canefe with us, who is a visiting fellow at the IWM currently. Otherwise, in her real life, I might say, in the ordinary life, works as a professor at the Department of Politics at York University, Toronto, Canada, and as a faculty member at graduate programs in social and political thought, socio-legal studies, and humanities, IBDM. As a scholar, she works in the fields of applied political philosophy, comparative politics, and international criminal law. From her areas of expertise, I'd like to just mention trauma, memory, and atrocities of war, international criminal law, mass violence, and finally, politics and ethics of hope. Nergis has widely published. I will save you from enumerating all her publications and will just refer to what is her latest book that came out with University of Chicago Press, 2021. The title of it is Crimes Against Humanities, The Limits of Universal Jurisdiction in the Global South. And as Nergis reframed it, she says, this is a Arendtian rereading of judgment into the debates on international criminal law. This might serve as a short introduction or presentation of this book. Nergis is also, and this has a special meaning to mention it here at the IWM, she is also the co-editor of the Journal of Conflict, Transformation and Security, and this is where IWM comes into play, currently is working on an issue, a special issue on Ukraine, and very much welcomes contributions for that issue. So here she is, she's around, speak to her if you're interested. And one thing I'd also like to mention, and you'll see it very soon on the screen, but it's also good to mention it beforehand, very different from very many scholars that we have here at the IWM. Nergis is also working as a practicing visual artist and mural painter. She has had several exhibitions and installations in public spaces, and especially over the last 5-6 years, she is experimenting a lot with the publication of art and essays in combination. This is her new, let's say, academic adventure that she is going for. Currently, she is pursuing two main projects. First, statelessness as a permanent state. Secondly, ethics of witnessing and redefining collective responsibility. This is very much her project here at the IWM, I would say, the second one. And today I once again read into the title that she gave, not the title of her talk today, this you already have on the screen, but the title of her project here at the IWM. And as a person brought up in a Catholic environment, it was very appealing to me. So I mentioned the title of her project at our institute, Mea culpa, sua culpa, tua maxima culpa, collective responsibility and judgment in the addressing of mass atrocities and war crimes. This is Nergis' project at the IWM. Nergis, we are very happy to have you here as a visiting fellow, and we're very happy about your lecture tonight. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm just going to change glasses. It's a great pleasure to be here. And what I'm going to do tonight is not just read you an academic paper, but also I'm going to invite you to I would say observe and perhaps think together so that at the end of these discussions, or rather the presentation, there will be some exchange, and I'm very, very happy to receive your feedback. So we're going to start with an excerpt that is all too familiar for those of you who grew up in Europe and its environs. It's one of the first parts, part of the first part of a very long poem. So it is the burial of the dead. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images, where the sun beats, and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. Under the brown fog of a winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge, so many I had not thought death had undone so many. That corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year? Or has the sudden frost disturbed its bed? This was an introduction to what I wanted to say, and this poem has a very special meaning in terms of the things that we're going to try to do here today, which is revisiting Patočka's thought, but also the origins of phenomenology as a response to the carnage of First World War in particular. This poem also relates to the same carnage and the debris that was left behind it. So, international law, and in particular what's known as the laws of war and humanitarian law, seems to be perpetually in crisis. Profound questions about its functions, utility, relevance, and ability to provide solutions in a complex and changing world marred by war and violence continue. However, these past few years have presented us with multiple new challenges, and I can only name a few: the Syrian exodus, the global pandemic, the abyss in Afghanistan, of course, followed by the invasion of Ukraine, which have led many of us to question the role and value of judgment, law, and legality, and the kind of accountability that actually emanates from the address of mass violence via the use of such tools. So this manuscript that I've been working on delves into a brief study of phenomenology of violence inspired by the work of Jan Patočka, while reading him in tandem with Hannah Arendt and her work on judgment, in an effort to restore faith in the human capacity to understand the hell we create on earth. As the manuscript examines the role of judgment and engagement in the determination of the scope of involvement of law legality, it revisits Patočka's interpretation of the First World War, particularly in the sixth of his Heretical Essays. As Patočka declared, the excessive character of the 20th century was best exemplified in the dangerously romantic conception of force. This work thus invites you, the audience, to commit yourselves to a deep reading of Patočka's Heretical Essays in tandem with Wars of the 20th Century and the 20th Century as War. We are in the 21st century, but I think the resonance continues. So, the paper that I have in front of me is about 1/3 of what I have in mind as it grows. Obviously, I'm not going to kill you going through each and every section of it here, but what I wanted to do was basically go through some of the main arguments so that I can get your feedback. So these images are actually my own artwork. This apparently is now the entrance mural for the Center for Refugee Studies at York University. This was done while I was in Europe. I'm very proud of it and happy for it. And I don't know what I've done. Okay, there you go. So the first section, I'm going to invite you to think through Patočka and Arendt with me. I named it Tales of 1,000 Wars. You might guess that there's a connection with the 1001 Nights' Tales from the Arabian Nights' Tales, and then there's a deep explanation as to why I've chosen that wording, but that there are also other references to the 1,000 Wars rhetoric. So taking its cues from various attempts to interpret World War I within the framework of 19th century ideas, Patočka questions the merits of examining war from the perspective of peace, day, light, thus excluding the dark side. At the core of his formulation lies the concept of the solidarity of shaken found in the Heretical Essays. Patočka also claims that war itself had become a fundamental phenomenon, bringing to light the metaphysical essence of our age. To understand what is at stake in these reflections on mass violence, we must come to terms with questions and problems of war and its excesses and what they raised for us, including our engagement with possible forms of collective responsibility. So, Patočka gives us detailed argumentation about the failed explanations about World War I, and what he leads us to question is, at the present historical juncture, and I'm going to bring that to your attention, whether the invasion of Ukraine, for instance, will become one of those events carved on historical memory of Europe, and thus will be responded to in a way that does justice to Patočka's call, or whether it will simply be set aside as a peripheral fissure in the totalitarian hubris casting a long shadow over the former Soviet republics. Regardless of its outcome, what would it take for Europe to be affected by acts of mass violence and excess at its current borders? Would historians of the future ponder these days, these very days that we live in, that once more recreated the conditions for a community to emerge, embodying the very terms of solidarity of the taken in Eastern Europe? One could approach the task of assessing the European response in two ways. Whether the old continent's attention to the ongoing war is currently waning and taking a pragmatic turn, and if so, whether that trend will endure to the effect of externalizing Ukrainian society. Alternatively, Ukraine would be brought into the fold of protections afforded by the EU in exchange for the fulfillment of the requirements of such a final inclusion. So the issue is not so much about how the European community responds, but very similar to what I shared with you at the opening. As the rhythm of hybrid war spreads into all spheres of life in Ukraine and beyond, the main stem of the way politics is undone through mass violence runs deep, and it cuts horizontally. Then emerge new sprouts from this existing stem with long internodes destined to generate new shoots and to spread further and further. It is these new upward growing shoots from the top of the nodes of mass violence and excess that will actually mark the future of Europe. Memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? And that is why Patočka's solidarity of the shaken is not just about Ukrainians, young Russian soldiers from ethnic republics sent to the front in exchange for a ticket out of poverty and destitution, or dissidents in Russia and Belarus who are paying the price of social death carefully executed by their respective states, or the others of this war in a tale of 1,000 wars that mark Europe's contemporary history. War offers a dramatic example of mass violence and victimization in excess. However, these acts of violence are accomplished through both state action and human agency put to work with intentionality, leading to a correspondent derogation of life worlds. As war confronts the daily life and unveils the dark side of rationality, could a turn to the radical individual act of phenomenological inquiry offer us a point of departure? A point of departure for a new part of philosophical pursuit toward genuine solidarity as social praxis. The concern, of course, here is to avoid creating a kind of critical ghetto of exclusive focus on the invasion of Ukraine. Rather, the aim is to prioritize the political and emancipatory aspects of such critical times, whilst acknowledging the necessity of drawing attention to the immediate dimensions of the unfolding of this particular war in 1,000 wars. A partial and fragmented inquiry would undermine this very perspective that both Patočka and Arendt's work symbolize on the subject of mass violence. Again, these are my own artworks. The photograph is from a workshop that I was a part of, which was on victimhood. These are two colleagues, they're actually actors. And then that's one of a series of 100 little sculptures I created and donated to the law school in Toronto. So it's in the Heretical Essays that Patočka introduces the concept of solidarity of the shaken, and he argues that such a sense of solidarity emerges under the conditions of political violence, but in particular mass violence, amounting to the frontline experience, Fronterlebnis. Patočka then brings into discussion these concepts of day, night, metanoia, sacrifice, to further problematize the idea of the glorification of war. Needless to say, Patočka didn't invent this vocabulary ex nihilo, and concepts such as the frontline experience and sacrifice and metaphors of day and night have been commonly used by thinkers in the interwar and post-war eras in their examination of Gemeinschaft. In particular, there has been critical dialogues between Patočka, Junger, and others in order to transcend individual suffering and open up the possibility of constituting a new form of solidarity and understanding. So it's interesting that Heretical Essays is considered as Patočka's final work, and Ludgar would know much better than I do. And it is commonly regarded as iconoclastic, and there's a reason for that, because Patočka starts with prehistory, approaches through the natural world as it is conceived by Husserl and Heidegger, and then moves on to discussing history as a quest for higher meaning, the opposite of life becoming a self-sustaining consumption. The exhibition that was opened last week actually had quotes that really spoke to that expectation. And in his critique of our times, Patočka underlines the European decline from its ancient Greek heritage to seek power rather than truth, splintering into ethnic subdivisions, and laments how the Enlightenment moved Europe from an ethical to an all-consuming material orientation. So if you kind of follow that trend of lamenting, we see something very similar, as also pointed out by Paul Ricoeur in Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition, as well as the origins of totalitarianism. The essential thread that runs through these texts is that Europe's loss of soul and spirit and the ultimate suicide during the two world wars, through this demise, there's always a dominance of war and darkness at the very heart of seemingly most rational projects of even promoting peace. So, in response, Patočka's bold reading of contemporary political reality calls for, and this is really important as far as I'm concerned, rehabilitation of Heraclitus's dictum, Polemos is the father of all things, and looking into the night and darkness of violence through a different lens. Here, of course, our challenge is to concentrate on the ontological significance of polemos rather than its metaphorical or mythical applications. Indeed, as Heraclitus wrote, polemos is the father of all things. Heraclitus refers to war and not divine providence. It is polemos that designates some mortals as mortals and others as immortals, with the dual capacity to bring all into existence or to annihilate. And polemos makes some men free, while others slave. Polemos raises the ultimate stake of liberty versus death. Troy was a well-ordered city, but Troy had to fall. Indeed, polemos was the watchword for Greek conquerors. The Roman counterpart of the word is bellum, which is all too familiar for those of us who deal with law. And interestingly, in Greek mythology, tellingly, polemos drew hubris, insolent arrogance, as his wife in lottery. If so, it is no wonder that in the fifth of his Heretical Essays, Patočka argues that 20th century was a century of war with all the potentiality that comes with it. And he makes a promise for the emergence of a new kind of community which will allow us to overcome the hubris. But what is this novel community? What does it represent in the political realm? Could you and I and others be part of that community? The most crucial and distinct aspect of his formulation seems to be that the solidarity of the shaken emerges out of conditions of mass political violence, and in particular, frontline or daily experience of destruction. Then he introduces the idea of metanoia to further develop this thesis. So, I mean, again, I'm not going to have time to refer to this debate, but along with Ludgar's work and inquiries, Patočka's introduction of the notion of fate in this very context, the fate that the solidarity of the shaken can be construed and it can bring another promise, is a conundrum yet a gift. As Patočka examines the response of Christianity, the community in this instance marked by unity in the belief of Christ is not a sufficient tool in the fight against a state of war throughout the 20th century and beyond. Patočka points to another major attempt to overcome the decline with similar disdain, the ideas of embracing progress and total mobilization of technology being utilized for the very interests of progress, only further extending and entrenching the state of war the 20th century is marked by it, albeit not in Europe anymore, but in its elsewheres. So, in response to these two mainstream reactions to the decline of humanity and what is known as European civilization, Patočka introduces this idea of solidarity of the shaken to fortify his understanding of history. It is not a community of Christian believers, but nor that of the men of steel who are deaf to all pain and later transformed to workers of the capitalist system. In Patočka's view, both proposed communities are antithetical to genuine meaning that lies in history. Instead, this community is identified by people who are at home with understanding both life and death, and not insensitized to either. This is his attempt to revive the positive aspects of the notion of community and solidly break with the regressive uses of it by fascism, totalitarianism, and populism, a need that is really in place today as well. So, looking at the time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly go over some of the arguments I introduced in terms of rereading Patočka's solidarity of the shaken through an Arendtian lens. And what I do is, in the work, this was the slide for Polemos as the father of all things. and reiteration of the act of fate. These images you might be very familiar with. This is the little Kurdish boy that washed off the shores of the Mediterranean. And the IWM also reenacted the collection of the body of the little boy. His mother and siblings were also drowned. Only the father survived as they were trying to cross the Eastern Mediterranean. My book on the Syrian Exodus is dedicated to his memory. And this image also became the basis for many of an artwork in terms of war and suffering and mass suffering and indifference in the European context from 2015 onwards. So that's why it's there. And I think what I'm going to talk about is, in the paper itself, I talk about sub-rosa authority of the state and how it actually masks violence, war, and excess by its presumed otherness. So part of the appeal of distancing and othering violence, especially mass violence, is that it serves as a metaphor for the limits of human reflexibility when moral issues are at stake. About the wars of others, violence inflicted upon others in other places, there are no immediate moral choices we have to make. These other lives are far too removed from us in order to be relevant for our own moral conduct, or so it seems. And that's why I have this picture. And then this is not for voyeuristic purposes, obviously, but I mean, this really haunted me to the point that I actually ended up creating an exhibition of artwork precisely around this image and drowning images. But that's just me. I mean, everybody reacts to these differently, and some don't see them. These stories of war and violence fail even as moral parables. These others of others' wars are depicted as alien to our universe and thus fictionalized. If so, could it be that the change that Patočka envisioned would be ushered by the experience of war and mass violence, metanoia, a recalling of the desire to violence, exacting a punishment for what has and what has not been done, cannot be actualized unless we're in the midst of it all? And the implication for that is, unless you're Ukrainian, unless you are actually in Kharkiv, does that mean we cannot relate to the war or the violence that's happening there? What is the possibility of the imminent potentiality that comes from the notion of solidarity of Shaken to take root in lands and places where there isn't an immediate confrontation with violence? And that's why I bring the Arendtian reading on judgment into the picture, and I basically look at the connection she makes in her later work between vita activa and vita contemplativa. And the text is far too dense for me to go through line by line, but what I'm going to suggest is that when Arendt started writing The Life of Mind, she introduces us to a new claim about judgment. Especially in the introduction to the first volume of The Life of Mind, Arendt already clarifies that her preoccupation with the activities of thinking, willing, and judging had two different origins. The immediate one was the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, but the second one was her desire to explore the counterpart of vita activa, vita contemplativa. Above and beyond the notion of the banality of evil lurked the question concerning the moral quality of judgment that led to Eichmann's deeds. And for Arendt, this was not simply a matter of ultimate depravity, corruption, or even sinfulness, but it was a decision and a choice. So how do we understand human capacity to will and to act via judgment is a fundamental concern with reference to the notion of responsibility. And I think you can kind of trace the thread in terms of where I started, where I'm going to, because we started with Patočka's call for us to really rethink the meaning of war within the European context and beyond, in terms of understanding construction of meaning and history, and the potential that lies in the context of the solidarity of the shaken, that is to say, people and communities who are exposed to direct mass violence and its excesses. But then the question was, if you're not in the front line, how do you somehow enter into that domain of critical engagement? Can you become a part of the milieu of the solidarity of the shaken when you're actually far removed, or so you feel? Do you have a moral obligation? Can you make a judgment about what's happening to others' lives in terms of perhaps acting, thinking, believing, and therefore engaging in vita activa in response to vita contemplativa? So in order to unpack this connection, I actually look at a very detailed reading of Arendt in terms of how she defines responsibility. And I think this is really, really important. And this is the kind of language that I believe Husserl, all those years ago, invited us to make our own for philosophy to really respond to crises. So for Arendt, there are three kinds or three levels of responsibility. Responsibility towards ourselves, which is directly related to how we make our presence in the world. Responsibility to judge, and responsibility to the world through our actions and choices about the world. And this is actually what Arendt referred to in her coinage of the term amor mundi. In her correspondence with her mentor and later friend Karl Jaspers, she expressed her desire to testify her love of the world. Out of gratitude, she said, I want to call my book about political theories Amor Mundi. Now, none of her publications assumed that title, yet this was her outspoken desire. Arendt surely possessed the gift of thinking with hope and a love of the world and humankind amid the ruins of some of European modernity's darkest times. And this is a trait she shares with Patočka. And it is characteristic of such thinking to perceive the processes of decay and demolition also as processes of crystallization and not an end in themselves. So both the work of Patočka and Arendt thus delivers us the promise of recovering our fate in the redemption of the world, but through action, will, choice, commitment, and judgment. This is despite their lengthy confrontations with religious belief and experiences of both Judaism and Christianity. But for each, the enigma of being alive comes with a heavy responsibility. And I have discussions here about, I don't know what I did. Yeah, I think this might be it. Yeah. These are all, again, my drawings. So for those of you who are interested in, there's a distinction that is really, really essential for us to understand responsibility in terms of guilt not being the equivalent of responsibility. And as Arendt says, if everybody is guilty, then nobody is. And if guilt is socialized to such a degree, then there's no accountability, so on and so forth. Responsibility is not guilt. It is the will and decision to act and to undertake a compassionate engagement with the world. So, as I go along the structure of what I have been trying to put together, I go into a discussion on Edmund Husserl's work. And you might ask why, because I mean, at the very beginning of the paper, there's a little quote from Husserl as well, but the idea is that for phenomenology, but especially phenomenology of violence, to become a blueprint for the renewal of both individual and social critical praxis, Patočka's idea of contemporary crisis of humanity, and both Patočka's and Arendt's notion of the possibility that it might be overcome in terms of engagement and assuming responsibility, I suppose that we have to go back to the Husserlian notion of intersubjectivity. And the intersubjective, the correlational, and the way that we envisage how violence actually becomes an embodiment in life. And it's not a an abnormal state of affairs, but it's actually part of the whole canon of human action, and therefore it requires a different kind of response than bracketing it, is where the paper goes. And I'm just going to read the very ending paragraph, because I'm looking at the time and I think we're kind of approaching towards the end of people's patience. Is that correct? Yes. So if you come back full circle, the transformative change of heart, repudiation, prostration, desire for atonement, the very term Patočka embraced, metanoia, requires the will to act and the desire to engage, more so than direct exposure to war, mass violence, and excess. That means you don't have to be in Ukraine to actually understand and to think about and to act about the Ukrainian crisis. It's just one example, but I think it's very, very relevant at the moment. And the solidarity of the shaken requires a sense of time and temporality that's intersubjective beyond what is present, as articulated in Husserl's discussion on Noema. So the intersubjective and a sense of temporality, common temporality, is more important than the very object that intentionality is directed towards. And this requires us to build bridges between vita activa and vita contemplativa, which is in Arendt's work, so that we exercise our very capacity of judgment as a way of being present in the world with responsibility. Thank you. Should I sit down? I think I should.
So, Nergis, yeah, I suggest maybe you to sit down for the discussion. You chose the nicest for the discussion, maybe. Thank you so much, Nergis. You were speaking about guilt, and speaking about guilt, I have to say I also feel a bit guilty now, because it was me who pushed you a few days ago and said, well, try to keep it short and try to keep it in like 30, 40 minutes. So I see, I pushed you to put a lot of things into a relatively short talk. Thanks for the effort. I think there was a lot in it. Notions of war, atrocities, forced migration. You spoke about the phenomenology of violence, different notions of violence, responsibility, the difficult question of collective responsibility, hope, some exegetic attempts of Patočka and Arendt, intentionality and Husserl. I just mentioned a few things that you brought into your talk. I think it was rather a lot, maybe too much. And this talk gives us the opportunity to take it a bit apart and maybe to discuss it a bit more quietly. And also what I would have to say is rather modest suggestions or questions on some of the points that you mentioned. I would like to start with a notion that is very important, not only for your talk today, but also for your work in general. This is collective responsibility. It was not so prominently presented in your talk today, but I think it is rather important to you. At one point of your talk, you speak about the different notions of collective responsibility and collective guilt, and you have the very nice Arendtian saying, there is no such thing as collective guilt, because if everybody is guilty, if all are guilty, then nobody is guilty, and definitely somebody is guilty and people are guilty. So if we want to further on speak about a reasonable concept of guilt, we cannot speak about something as a collective guilt. But is there a collective responsibility? I think we would rather say yes, for very practical reasons of international law, for questions of compensation and so on. We would want to keep something as a community's responsibility. We would want to have something as a nation's responsibility. I'm not fully sure where you lead us in your talk, and as I said, you have worked on this a lot, so I would really be curious to hear more from you about collective responsibility. At some point you say collective responsibility is a vicarious responsibility. That means it's a way to get rid of responsibility. How do you see this? I would say, going back to Patočka, responsibility is a rather individual thing, always and necessarily so. And interestingly, especially this notion of the solidarity of the shaken, This is a responsibility of the individual, but of the individual reaching out to other individuals. This is the way how I would put it, but I mean the core, the philosophical core happening is an individual one. And interestingly, so I've never said that before. I have spoken about Patočka quite a lot, but I've never said it before. It came to my mind only now with this notion of the solidarity of the shaken. The interesting point of this individual shakenness, in fact, is something that has to do with rather being unshaken. There is this individual experience of shakenness, but what is it about? It is about not being blackmailed any longer with the so-called promises of the day, with a career, with a good life, with a prosperous future, and so on. And after going through so many experiences of being shaken, there is this one understanding that you cannot be blackmailed any longer by this one thing that shakes us the most, and that is death and the expectation of death. So it's a certain unshakenness in regards to death that makes this, that is the core of this individual experience, I would say. So this as a very, as a question of understanding for the notion of collective responsibility. Then at one point you also speak about Patočka and Arendt as thinkers of a process of decadence or process of decline, and you say they rather take this process of decadence as a crystallization point. They try to get the best out of it and see it as a crystallization of something insightful. And you say, and this is a quote, you speak about them being both Patočka and Arendt as thinkers who give us the gift of thinking with hope. So this is my next question for you, because this is rather another topic that you have worked on a lot. Ethics of hope is an important topic of your work. I would want to ask you, what notion of hope is this? And somehow it is very similar to what I have asked before, namely, is it an individual hope? Does it have to do with the individual, with the subject acting out of hope or experience of hope? Or is it rather a societal, or we could even ask a metaphysical one? There's a very nice saying by Václav Havel that says, I'm not sure if I can quote it fully correctly, but that says more or less, hope is not the belief that things will turn out well at the end, but hope is the understanding that what I'm doing currently now at this moment, that this is meaningful. This is the notion of hope. So it's coming from a rather individualistic point of view. So the second question I would want to have on hope. And then I would maybe have two small points that come closer to what you were trying also, namely to have closer references to current happenings in European politics, European history. You have a very nice definition at the end of your paper. Maybe you have not even quoted it now, but I was reading it, so I'm referring to that. And you have a notion of what Patočka calls metanoia. Metanoia is the turning around, the reversal of your inner life, going back to the Greek tradition. And you have a very, very nice definition of it. And you say, this, I quote, is the will to act and the desire to be engaged. And I would want to ask you if this is not rather, this for me would be the strongest reference to the current situation. And I say it straight, I rather doubt if we can get any, like for me, it's difficult to get rather any meaningful insights of the comparison of Patočka's notion of war with the current war going on in Ukraine. I see big difficulties there. We can discuss this more in detail, but the really inspiring thing is maybe this one definition that you give, the will to act and the desire to be engaged. And if we look at somebody, as you may all have read today about a person at the City Council of Moscow, Alexei Gorinov is his name. He was condemned today, and the really, really moving speech that he gave, and his reference to like cosmic metaphors, speaking about his 7 years that he was sentenced to in comparison to what this means to the suffering of individuals in Ukraine, to what it means in like, it's even cosmological. He's really speaking about cosmological things. I really think that this is a very, very eminent understanding of what it could mean, what it means to speak of a solidarity of a shaken. And in his case, once again, it is a very, very individual thing, but you see something like solidarity happening. I mean, it's first of all, it's his, and he said it explicitly, he was speaking about it, solidarity, his reaching out to the people at the other side, to those who are kept out of public discussion. So this is his active solidarity, but there is also something happening immediately. This guy today has experienced quite, and I think it is remarkable for the Russian society of today, quite a remarkable solidarity from others in Russia. There was very, very many addresses of solidarity to him. So I really think he's a rather striking example, and a fitting example. While, and I have said it before, and this then is my last point, while I have really difficulties to compare the current war situation with Patočka's notion of the front experience in the First World War. I mean, this was sitting in the trenches for years. Everybody probably had lost the belief that it is about anything meaningful, rather than continuing with the war that, I mean, nobody any longer understood what it was good for. I really find it difficult to compare this to the current situation in Ukraine. And maybe this also gives you an opportunity to be, because this very much you wanted to do, I mean, you wanted to draw the parallel, maybe this would give you an opportunity also to elaborate a bit more on how you see this context. This is my remarks for the moment. I think you should have the possibility to react on that, and then we will open it up to all of you. Please, Nergis.
Thank you. I really, really appreciate these comments, questions, and suggestions. So I'm going to start with collective responsibility, the separation of guilt and responsibility. I spent about 10 years trying to understand the adjudication of responsibility for mass crimes, both through the legal architecture, but also in terms of what we call in the trade transitional justice measures. And so the place that all these interrogations brought me to was that the vicarious responsibility accusation really applies even to many of the transitional justice measures, because thereby you go for individual assessment of criminality for heads of the state, you remove the immunity, you brought them to court, and or you start truth and reconciliation and amnesty measures, and then you presume the chapter is closed. So for those of you who are familiar with war crimes and crimes against humanity in places like Cambodia, like Sri Lanka, like Colombia, there is a debris left behind these individual criminalizations and attribution of responsibility to people in power. What needs to be done, in my opinion, and it's not just my opinion, but I think it's an increasing local opinion among international legal theoreticians, is that responsibility has to be distributed horizontally. And it has to come with reparations. It has to be longue durée. It cannot just be through criminal justice system. And in that sense, it cannot be individualized only, because it's a societal affair. War is a societal affair. War takes place because individuals act differently, presuming immunity in a kind of sociality that crowns mass violence, and then that provides protections for that crowning of mass violence. So that's why I think it's really important to move from the only, how shall we say, the framing of responsibility only as an individual affair, but perhaps also look into the levels of societal engagement in terms of reparations, in terms of rethinking. And you know, I think you're really right. Patočka's metanoia, I mean, I am here partly to learn more about Patočka and to reread and to discover more in detail things that I saw and that spoke to me, and one of them was metanoia. And metanoia actually also identifies, I think, if I understood you correctly, a strong fate in terms of rejuvenation and as you say, like unshakenness. And I think I am too much of an Arendtian in the sense that politics is the beginning and end of life. So individual subjective experiences of metanoia would not be possible unless we contextualize it socially and historically. And that's why I think my attempt to bring Husserl into the picture might be forgiven or perhaps appreciated, because when we talk about a kind of temporality that's not just individual, but it belongs to our epoch. It belongs to the shared experiences of humanity. It's no longer our understanding of the self and the subject and the other, but as Arendt has long argued, it's the sociality of politics that makes us construct and then activate meaning. And action also starts with politics and political understanding. And here, I think many Arendtian scholars argued that it's also rehabilitation of politics. We lost the meaning of politics, and I've written about this when I was really young, and I was working on fascist movements in the Middle East, and I mean, I must have been in my 20s, and I said something like, "This is the death of politics," but I did not know much Arendt at that moment, and I was a very young international student, and for me, it felt like, I mean, like many of you here, I grew up under a military coup. I lost family and friends to torture and exile, and I worked as an expert witness to many of acts of state criminality. So for me, all of these basically led to the emptying of the sphere for politics and for intersubjective relationality, for acceptance of differences of opinion, and for the possibility of coming up with a different form of life regardless of the differences. So that's why I think you're right. I'm trying to read into Patočka an Arendtian sense of politics and a Husserlian sense of temporality that is shared. Now, in terms of the crystallization and the gift of thinking and thinking with hope, again, I think it goes back to my kind of line of thinking that goes way back to Aristotle and comes forward. But only in the last year or so, I kept thinking about Arendt's love of the world. And I kept thinking, why such a choice? Why such a choice of the words? Especially looking at what she dealt with in her work and in her personal experience. Why would someone, towards the end of their life, when they've seen the darkest of all that they could see, make a declaration as such, that they harbored this innate love of the world? And I felt like it was the notion of responsibility, the fact that, like Havel said, what I do now has meaning. It's not all lost, because we have the counterpart of Arendt and Benjamin, who committed suicide. And I don't think it was an individual act of basically collapsing, but it was more so the possibility of some sort of a promise that is future-looking was not present in Benjamin's thought. And who knows what circumstances made him feel that there was nothing to move forward. But I think if I am seeing any hope, both in terms of Patočka's work and also in terms of Arendt, it is that notion that responsibility will enable the impulse to use judgment, which Eichmann did not do. Or rather, he did, but the kind of judgment that he used did not include vita contemplativa. It was more of a socialized, the impunity that comes with mass violence and state-sponsored violence that led him to act. And the desire to silence, the example that you gave out of current Russia. And in the paper and in a lot of my work, I talk about fictionalization of the violence that is committed against others, violence in other places, and that's what you're asking, I think. You're saying, you know, the Ukrainian war or the war in Ukraine, violence against Ukraine is far too far away from the European mindset, and it does not have the same weight like the two world wars. that affected every family and that affected the whole continent. And that's why I don't know whether in the flow of things you catch the phraseology I used about the rhizome. Those flowers, those of you who do gardening, they're very interesting. If you ever go to buy them, they're sold in this kind of can of dust and sawdust, and then you pick up these roots. They don't look like bulbs, they don't look like anything. But if they take root, what they do is they'll take over the entire field, because from the stem will start new nodes and then new nodes. And this normalization of violence and normalization of war and normalization of massacre and normalization of externalization of war actually in the long run seeds horizontally and very deeply. And today it could be Ukraine, tomorrow it could be somewhere else. But that's what I'm trying to bring to the fore, so that perhaps we can change the idiom, the discussion. It's not that far away. It's actually like the rhizomes growing under. And I mean, we can take that argument further about this Sunday, as I was telling you, I was walking downtown Vienna, and then there were all these demonstrations, which I couldn't quite pinpoint. But I believe one element of that was about not wanting refugees, whether they are Syrian or Ukrainian or what else. And it is part of that rhizome, again, growing, externalizing, bracketing. And what that does is actually shrinks the European life world. And it kind of makes Europe a poorer place in terms of the spirit and the soul. And it does affect everybody in the long run, but I think the craft is to create a new language of phenomenology of violence that makes it more apparent to the public.
Thanks, Nergis. So as I announced before, I'd like to open up to your questions, remarks. Olga?
Yes, thank you very much for your lecture. I would like to discuss a little bit this not legal collective responsibility. If I understand well, it's possible to think about not legal collective.
Exactly.
Yeah, and we have idea proposed by Jaspers, for example, and he had moral, political, metaphysical, and legal sorts of collective responsibility. Is it must we use this notion, this differentiation proposed by Jaspers, or you have another understanding of these not legal collective responsibilities, and how we can connect this not legal and legal collective responsibility? Because for me there is not only theoretical but practical question. I'm from Belarus, and there are this discussion, and I feeling that I have political and moral responsibility for this war in this situation, but not legal responsibility. Lukashenko has this legal responsibility, but what is it, and what means this not legal responsibility in your terms and your understanding?
Can I respond? And I'd really like to spend some time with you to discuss this further. In the latest book, I have a whole chapter on the Arendt-Jaspers correspondence on the issue of responsibility and guilt, and I think what I'm trying to get to is societal responsibility. So it's not political per se, because political also has direct connotations in terms of future legal responsibility, and it certainly is not moral, which then brings you to the domain of guilt. And metaphysical, perhaps that's the only point Arendt and Jaspers might be in agreement with, but the Arendtian reading of judgment and her rereading of Kant suggests that judgment is not an individual act. It's rooted in sociality, and it's rooted in your presence in the world in terms of understanding the temporality and then the common fate of the society that you're living in. So what I did was, in my work, I took that sociality of responsibility and basically put it against adjudication of international crimes by heads of state and other highly responsible people, and I went into a whole discussion by various philosophers on the pitfalls of collective responsibility if it was legalized. If it's not legalized, then it basically brings us to an unknown place, whereby we know that certain acts cannot take place without societal involvement and endorsement. And this also goes to ethics of witnessing. When you're a bystander, when something is happening, like it's happening in Europe, they're a bystander in the Ukrainian conflict as far as the civilians are concerned, not the heads of the state in Europe, but does your responsibility end there? Or by simply just watching and not doing anything, it is actually part of that total act? And it's a very difficult question, especially in terms of mass crimes happening elsewhere, not with you, but to somebody else. But in some way they are related to you. In the case of Ukraine, they are related to you because of history, civilization, regional dynamics. In the case of Syria, they are related to you because perhaps people are trying to reach to you, or perhaps you had prior engagement in the region, or perhaps humanity matters in terms of children like the one that I showed you drowning in the sea. The relationality needs to be established, but that's the basis of sociality of responsibility, rather than that being individual. Because if you can it to individual responsibility, the only place you can go is either moral, which is guilt, or legal, which is criminal. But acts of mass violence are societal. They're neither abnormal nor out of sociality. These acts cannot happen without the state condoning them, and the state is not away from us. We are part of that relationality, which is the state. We are part of that endorsement of the legality of the state. So I mean, I think I'm pushing something to an extreme, but I really want to. And this is the life I lived, and everywhere I worked, and I worked comparatively. So I worked in war crime situations in different continents. I'm seeing the same thing. Without the people, the bystanders, the civilians, the ones who do nothing about it, being there and endorsing the act, those kinds of excesses of violence cannot take place. And so the responsibility cannot be criminal in that sense, but it has to be a societal accounting for what has happened. And I think if you go back to Holocaust studies as a genre and the German experience about what do you do with the historical memories of the two world wars, but especially the Second World War, it's not about individual responsibility. It's not about the German society today either, because it's what, the third generation now. So, but it's still there, partially because, and those of you who are from this part of the world would know much better than I do, that there is a sense that it wasn't an aberration of European history. It was an essential part of European history, a part that Germans and others alike may not necessarily want to relive through. And that's what societal responsibility means, owning up to it, not closing the book, basically continuing the remunerations about what has happened. And I think in the Ukrainian crisis, I really do see the potential for it to be happening like that, and I'm going to push it somewhere else. The reason being, please forgive me, but how many of you are from Ukraine in this audience? Just one. Okay, so IWM is a different place because they're having fellowships and residences. But if you go out anywhere, in any of the capitals of Europe right now, there are Ukrainians everywhere. There is a diaspora. They're living and breathing. And they're going to continue to live and breathe. And they keep the memory alive. And they are not destitute. They're writers and thinkers and academics and poets and artists, as well as lay people. But the mind and soul of Ukraine is pouring out to Europe, which makes it impossible for Europe not to see it. And so maybe it's not the frontline experience in the way Patočka might have described, but it's a different kind of encounter that's present.
Thanks, Dan. Any other remarks? Please. The Ukraine remark.
Hello, thank you for your lecture, very interesting. I wanted to ask, do you think like Ukrainian case now will change how collective societal responsibility, kind of both for, you know, the perpetrator nation, what it means, and for the observers? Because this is probably the first war that is so well documented and so like transmitted in real life, and you can basically watch war crimes like happening in real life, you know, live stream or like tweeting about them.
That's right.
So do you think this will change something in them?
I mean, there's always a danger that I've been teaching human rights law for about 20 years now. And early on, when I first started in different locations, different countries, I used to use documentaries. There's so much about the atrocities and the hell we create for each other, right? And I observed that my students, the fellow colleagues in the venues where I was lecturing and teaching, after a certain point they'd go numb. And there's a limit, and there's a danger that Susan Sontag talks so well, and Kristeva talks so well, and Judith Butler talks so well about watching the suffering of others, at which point you basically are numbed, and it becomes, you just cannot relate to it anymore. It's a very humane reaction. So the realistic projections of war and Ukrainian war crimes, unless there are real persons associated with these crimes and their effects, has this potential of waning and then becoming this background noise of, you know, I had students that I supervised who wrote their PhDs on violence in the Middle East, and one of them was a practicing artist, and then she looked at all the imageries coming out of Middle East that was circulating globally that basically portrayed the region as a place where people just kill each other. Like that was the emotion that was emanating, because there was like this bombardment of images coming out of Syria, coming out of Libya, coming out of Egypt, and centuries-old Middle Eastern history was basically erased as a result of this exposure. The same for the Balkans. I mean, Ivan just left, but Balkanization actually became a term in the Oxford Dictionary, meaning, you know, you divide and rule and then you cannot keep things together. So what I'm trying to say is, when there is constant exposure of one dimension of what's happening, there is a danger that it would actually be ossified and essentialized. So that's what happens in Eastern Europe. You know, Russians and their former republics fight wars. They are not akin to democracy. They don't know what to do with conflict, etc., etc. That's the danger of overexposure. I think if that exposure is accompanied by real life presence, like IWM is doing, of thinkers, writers, journalists, artists, public leaders, speaking, explaining, giving content, and making it a real part of the lived moment of European history and politics, then there could be a different understanding. But I think it's at the moment just like really, really unclear. And there aren't that many places where you would see Ukrainian exiles or dissidents being brought to the front, invited to the front to talk about it. If it's only portrayed as a catastrophe, then it won't have that effect, because, you know, for the sake of humanity, we have done so much to each other in so unforgivable ways. What Russia does in Ukraine is a continuation of that trend.
Thanks, Nergis. We will have the opportunity to discuss things further on. I suggest, if there's no other urgent remark now, we end the public part here. For those of us who know us and who have been more regularly guests of IWM, as an exception today, we will have no wine and cheese. This does not mean that we will never have it again. This is just for internal reasons, because we had other things going on already this week. So welcome back again next time for wine and cheese. We will not have it today. So thanks to you all for attending the lecture tonight, and most of all, Nergis, thanks to you. not only for sharing your ideas with us, but also your artwork. It was very nice, and it's, as I said in the beginning, we're very happy to have you here as a fellow. Thanks for the talk tonight, and this is your applause.
Thank you.